We're going to do something a little differently today, and instead of focusing on a region over hundreds and hundreds of years to get a sense of themes like we have been doing, we're going to focus really closely on the life and accomplishments of one guy, a guy named Alexander the Great, who conquered an insane amount of land and then died pretty shortly thereafter. But in his lifetime, established himself as a legend and changed the part of the world that he conquered forever and ever by bringing Greek culture to it in something called Hellenism. So while in this class we've been looking at like big chunks of time and giant themes, today we're going to start in the year 336 BCE. Alexander the Great is one of history's great legends, and there's a secret hidden proof of his legend in today's presentation. If anybody figures it out, I will be super impressed. I'm going to tell you his story first. You're going to get the legend, and then at the end we're going to talk about the historical significance, the point of it all. The story of Alexander the Great begins with the words from his father to him when his ambition and his extraordinary talent became clear. His father, King Philip of Macedon, said, "My son, ask for thyself another kingdom, for that which I leave is too small for thee." And it was. If you look at the top right of the slide, Macedon is highlighted in green. It was this little tiny kingdom just north of the Greek peninsula. So that's where the story starts. Near to the east, in that little tiny part of ancient Greece, in an ancient land called Macedonia, there was born a son to Philip II of Macedon. He's our legend. His name was Alexander. When he was only 19 years old, he became the Macedon king. And ambitious, he swore to free all of Asia Minor from Persia. Asia Minor was what they called Turkey back then. The thing about Alexander is that he tended to win battles that he fought. By the Aegean Sea in 334 BC, he utterly beat the armies of Persia. King Darius III fled Persia. And then after that, Alexander won battle after battle after battle in pretty short order. The Scythians fell by the river Jaxartes. Then Egypt fell to the Macedon king as well, and he founded a city there called Alexandria. By the Tigris River, he met King Darius again and crushed him again in the Battle of Arbela. And then entering Babylon and Susa, he found all these treasures, and then he kept going, took the capital of Persia, Persepolis, in modern-day Iran. Winning battle after battle after battle after battle, so young, made Alexander a legend in his own time. His name struck fear into the hearts of men, and he became something of a god among mortal men. People didn't worship him as a god, of course. He achieved hero status within his own lifetime in a way that was pretty clear, and for very clear reasons. If you look at the bottom right of the map, check out everything Alexander conquered. The legend of Alexander continues as he marched on and on and on. There is a pretty famous story about something called the Gordian knot that people tell over and over, and it's become like a way of speaking about cutting through a problem in an unusual way. The legend says there was a Phrygian king who had bound a chariot yoke with a really, really tight knot that nobody could untie. The legend was whoever could untie the knot would be the future ruler of Asia. So of course, Alexander had to give it a shot. And instead of undoing the knot the way, we undo shoelaces, he just cut it. So legend says he was destined to become the master of Asia. As he conquered more and more land, he spread Greek culture, Greek rationalism, Greek science with him, the language too. The spread of Greek culture into the Middle East, and especially as it mingled with the cultures that were already there, came to be known as Hellenism. And he spread Hellenism far and wide, the Macedonian learned mind. He was tutored by Aristotle, one of the most prolific Greek philosophers. As we learned before, the Greek culture kind of became the Western way of life. And so in spreading Greek rationalism, just in conquering this land, he didn't intend to do it in order to spread Greek rationalism, but he did. The Western way of life came into the Middle East and blended and became something new. In spreading the Greek language, you could argue he even paved the way for Christianity, because if the entire ancient world spoke Greek, it was possible to spread the teaching of the Gospels, which were written in Greek. All this, as he continued to conquer, the man couldn't stop. His army was getting tired, though, marching and marching and marching. And the deal breaker was India. Alexander wanted to keep going after he'd gotten Persia. He wanted to conquer the Indian subcontinent. He was destined to be the master of Asia, after all. And his army would not follow him to India, tired of the combat and pain and exhausting glory. Still, Alexander was a legend. They retreated to the Persian Empire. His name continued to strike fear into the hearts of men, even though they didn't take India. And yet, Alexander died of a very mundane, normal, non-legendary cause. He died of a fever in Babylon. So what's the point of all this? We get to our key points. The point of Alexander the Great's story for our big overview of history purposes is the story about diffusion of culture and how it can diffuse through conquest and state expansion. Alexander the Great was one of history's great warriors. He inspired generals for hundreds and hundreds of years after him. He inspired part of this PowerPoint. If you figured it out, I'm impressed. Of his biography, the most important points were that he was the leader of Macedonia, a small state near Greece, very, very affected by Greek culture. He was tutored by, like I said, Aristotle, a Greek philosopher, and created an empire that included Greece, Egypt, modern-day Turkey, modern-day Iran, parts of South Asia. So gigantic empire. And even though he died in pretty short order, his legend continues. And his legacy, in terms of diffusing Greek culture to Eurasia, was critically important for the rest of world history. Like I said before, Hellenism, it refers to the culture of classical Greece, like rationalism, architecture, and so on, as it spread through the ancient world through his conquests. And if you look at the slide, there are a couple ways of seeing this. Just in the architecture, you can absolutely see the influence of Greek architecture in places that Alexander conquered. In the middle of the slide, there is an artist's impression of the Acropolis in Athens, Greece, when it was a city-state. And then towards the bottom, you can see a picture of what's left of the Pergamon and an artist's rendition of what it must have looked like at the time in the Middle East, in modern-day Turkey. He also loved naming cities after himself, and so you will find cities called Alexandria all throughout his conquests. Alexander the Great also leaves us with some pretty major historical issues that are always worth keeping an eye on. For one thing, I use the words marched. He marched his army, he took a city, he conquered these places. And using those words just like that kind of hides a lot of effort, a lot of violence, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknown. It's easy to tell the story of Alexander the Great and people like him with like their ultimate success kind of coming to seem like the obvious and necessary conclusion of this story. So it's always important to keep in mind that at any point in history, things could have gone differently. Alexander was not destined to be the ruler of Asia. He became the ruler of Asia because of historical circumstance and how his efforts played into them. It's also important to think about all of the people who lived in the territory that he conquered. Conquest is violent. At heart, really, it's about being violent to people and taking their stuff, taking their resources, and claiming ownership of them. And the conquered tend not to leave as striking a mark in the historical record as the conquerors. So it's always critical to keep that in mind. And it also hides like kind of the cool unknown parts of the story, just in terms of like what people knew and didn't know back then. They didn't have maps to India, for example. Alexander had no idea how big it was when he started to try to conquer it. Who knows what would have happened if his army hadn't said no? So, Alexander the Great, an interesting case study in legends and what we can make of them, an interesting study in what a 19-year-old can accomplish when he really sets his mind on it, of a father recognizing ambition in his son, and of the spread of Greek culture that will make a comeback in history if you give me a few weeks.